Hi, my name is Doug Jensen, and welcome to my masterclass for Sony's new PXW-Z280 and Z190 camcorders. Over the next few hours, we're going to take a detailed look at the most important aspects of these two revolutionary 4K cameras, and I'll get you up to speed shooting great video as quickly as possible. Clearly, the Z280 and Z190 are well suited for many kinds of shooting situations, including documentaries, weddings, corporate video, military, broadcast news, sports, reality TV, and anything where speed and efficiency are important. As you probably already know, these two camcorders are the latest models in Sony's 4K product line, which includes such popular cameras as the FS7, the FS5, the Z150, the little Z90, and even the high-end PXW-Z450. In fact, even though they might not look very similar on the outside, both the Z280 and the Z190 could be considered junior versions of the Z450 because they share many of the same advanced features and functions. Now, if you're familiar with previous Sony camcorders, the easiest way to describe the Z280 is that it's the 4K version of the PXW-X200. And the Z190 is the 4K version of the X180. But hold on just a second, because as you'll see over the next few hours, that's a gross oversimplification of what these two cameras are all about. 4K resolution is just the tip of the iceberg of what makes these two new cameras so great. Compared to their predecessors, not only do the Z280 and Z190 have 4K resolution, they can record at up to 60 frames per second. They can record with hybrid log gamma, or HLG. They feature Sony's revolutionary electronic variable ND filter. They have a digital extender mode that essentially doubles the camera's focal length when shooting in HD with no loss of light or image quality. They have high-resolution OLED viewfinders. They have the ability to transfer clips directly to an attached hard drive or SSD without the need for a computer. They have more robust streaming and wireless transfer functions. They have improved face detection autofocus. They have two multi-interface shoes for easy attachment of lights and wireless microphone receivers. They even have improved ergonomics and better balance versus the cameras they replaced. You know, in a time and age when large sensor cinema camcorders, mirrorless cameras, and DSLRs are all the rage, it's easy to forget that there is a bigger need than ever for traditional, fixed-lens, handheld professional camcorders that are the bread and butter of news gathering, documentaries, reality television, and event production. Now, even though I'll admit that 90% of my own shooting is done with large sensor cinema cameras because that's what the work I do calls for, I've been saying for years that there are a lot of people in this business who would be much better served by a fixed-lens, easy-to-use 4K camcorder. In my opinion, too many people have gotten sucked into the glamour of big sensors, shallow depth of field, and pimped out cameras with matte boxes, external monitors, follow focus rigs, and other accessories hanging off of their cameras. They have totally lost sight that those are quite often not the best tools for the job. Sometimes they are, but a lot of times they're not. In my opinion, the Z280 and the Z190 have been designed for people who have important work to get done, work that actually pays, who expect all the features and functions of a high-end professional E&G camera, who need the convenience of a zoom lens with a wide range of focal lengths and a fast maximum aperture, and who don't want to futz around with a lot of extra bulky accessories clamped onto their cameras. Now, you may be wondering why I'm so excited by these cameras when Sony already has several small 4K Handycam style cameras in their lineup, which I also happen to own. So what's the big deal now? Well, there are three big changes these cameras bring to the table. First, they're the world's first 4K broadcast camcorders to use 3 1/2-inch or 3 1/3-inch sensors. Red, blue, and green light are independently captured by separate image sensors, contributing to better image quality than similar cameras with only one sensor. Second, both cameras can record in 4K, up to 60 frames per second. In fact, the Z280 even includes Sony's flagship XAVCI recording format, which is 10-bit 422. And the third thing that has me so enthusiastic about the Z280 and Z190 is something that you might not even hear other people ever talk about. Yet it's actually more important to me than either of the other two reasons I just mentioned. I don't know if you've ever noticed it or not, but Sony actually has two different divisions that make professional camcorders. First, there's what I would call the XT-Cam division that builds the models that are intended to be used by broadcasters in high-end productions. Cameras such as the F55, FS7, F3, Z450, PMW-200, and even the original EX1 and EX3 from more than a decade ago. And then there's what I would call the NX-Cam division that manufactures the more prosumer-oriented camcorders, such as the Z150, Z90, FS100, FS700, and even the very popular FS5. That's right, the FS5 is not part of the XT-Cam product line. It comes from what I call the NX-Cam division. And that's why, if you've used both of them before, you know that the FS5 is operationally very different from the FS7, even though they have a similar outward appearance. Now, although the lines between these two different parts of Sony have become blurred in recent years, and I'm not even sure Sony still divides the company up the way I'm describing it, when I look at the camcorders that Sony sells today, there is still a very distinct line between one group of cameras and the other. For my purposes, I call those two groups XT-Cam and NX-Cam. So even though those labels might not be completely valid anymore, that's still how I divide them in my mind. So why does that distinction matter? Well, I'll explain. Although both product lines offer excellent cameras that are perfectly capable of creating stunning images, there's a huge difference between XT-Cam and NX-Cam when you look at the design of the menu systems, and more importantly, the dozens of advanced features and functions that are only found on the XT-Cam models. Of course, if you don't have experience with both product lines, as I do, then you might not even be aware that there are significant differences between them. So what exactly am I talking about when I say the XT-Cam camcorders are superior to their NX-Cam cousins? Well, even though the purpose of this video is not to be a camcorder review or a buying guide or a camera comparison, let's go down that road anyway for a few minutes to compare the Z280 and Z190 to the Z150, which looks similar but has almost nothing in common with the newer cameras. In fact, most of the differences I'm going to point out also apply to the FS5. So even if you don't give a hoot about the Z150 or FS5, just consider the next few minutes to be a highlight list of the many features and functions that we'll be covering through the next few hours of this masterclass. Compared to the Z150, the Z280 and Z190 have more robust physical construction, a 17x or 25x zoom lens versus only 12x for the Z150. Faster maximum apertures, especially at the telephoto end of the zoom range, where the Z150 is only f4. A much nicer viewfinder on both cameras, especially the Z280, which is twice the resolution of the Z150. Sony's very cool electronic variable neutral density filter, which allows you to adjust the brightness of the exposure seamlessly, like the dimmer on an LED light. Simultaneous HDMI and SDI output, even when shooting 4K. No loss of video output or monitoring during 4K recording. Sony's high-end XAVCI codec that is usually reserved only for high-end cameras like the F55, F5, FS7, and Z450. Even the FS5 doesn't offer this codec. 10-bit 422 4K versus only 8-bit 420 on the Z150 and FS5. 4K at 60 frames per second versus only 30 frames per second on the Z150 and even the FS5. A clip continuous record mode that allows you to create one giant video file on the memory card no matter how many times you start and stop recording. Simultaneous recording of 4K and HD on the same memory card. 4K slow motion at up to 60 frames per second. 10 customizable assign buttons on the Z280 and 8 on the Z190 versus only 6 on the Z150. And even more important, both cameras have a far greater number of available functions that can be assigned to those buttons. A dedicated white balance set button, a 3-position white balance memory toggle switch, a 3-position gain toggle switch, a dedicated steady shot on-off button, a slow shutter mode that goes up to a whopping 64 frames of accumulation versus only 4 frames for the Z150. 4 channels of audio versus only 2 on the Z150 and FS5. External independent switches and volume dials for all 4 audio channels. Headphone volume that can be adjusted with external controls rather than having to dig into the menus. better signal-to-noise ratio for audio coming in through the MI shoe, 12-volt power for increased compatibility with other devices such as AC adapters and professional batteries, a USB host mode that allows you to copy clips directly from a memory card in the camera to an ordinary hard drive or SSD connected via a USB cable, Gen Lock-In for precise synchronization with other cameras or switchers, timecode in-out for jam syncing multiple cameras together with matching timecode, clip duration display, which is one of my favorite features of all the XT-Cam cameras. We'll talk more about this later. The ability to insert invisible shot marks or clip flags at the touch of a button so that important moments are easier to find in post. A customizable user menu that allows you to design your own custom menu system on board the camera so that the menus you use most frequently are readily available and everything else is hidden away and out of sight. This is a huge time-saving feature that makes working with the camera so much more efficient. In fact, you can even set up your camera to require a passcode to change any menus that aren't in the user menu, which is a great way to limit the access of students, unskilled coworkers, and such. A customizable user box that allows you to draw a rectangular marker of any size and dimensions anywhere on the screen to help with framing. I use it all the time as a placeholder for graphics that will be added later in post. When you press the menu button, you're always brought directly back to whichever menu you were using last, another time-saving feature that makes working with the camera so much more efficient. The ability to import planning metadata to describe the subject matter and add keywords before shooting even begins. Custom clip naming on board the camera. This is a huge feature in my book. Being able to take control of exactly how your clips will be named is not only a gigantic time saver in post, but also with long-term archiving, cataloging, and footage management. You even have the option of displaying the current clip name in the viewfinder while you're shooting. I love this feature because it often eliminates the need to keep cumbersome timecode notes. Instead of strings of timecode numbers, you just jot down the actual file name of good takes and any other shots you want to be able to find quickly in post. Last Clip Delete is a feature that I've really missed on many of Sony's most recent camcorders, and I'm happy that we've got it back on the Z280 and Z190. The ability to instantly delete bad takes or any other clips you know you don't want to keep not only frees up space on your memory cards, it also saves time ingesting footage that you already know you'll never use. And it speeds up editing because you'll have fewer clips to deal with in post. It's like doing a rough cut right at the time of shooting. You can customize the threshold where the low battery alarm is triggered, plus adjust the volume at which it sounds. Both of the new cameras have better autofocus with improved face detection. And if you think you won't use autofocus sometimes, I suggest you keep an open mind. You can shoot really cool ultra close-up shots using the camera's manual macro focusing mode. You can control the amount of noise suppression that you want your camera to apply to your footage. You can customize the metering zone, or in other words, what part of the frame the camera looks at when it adjusts the auto exposure. For example, if you want to tell the camera to ignore bright skies and thus give more weight to the foreground, you can do that. You can even customize how quickly the auto exposure reacts when it senses changes in the scene that you're shooting. Custom scene files can be saved and recalled individually rather than all of them at once like the Z150 requires. There's a third memory card slot that's used for saving your custom settings on an SD utility card. That way, when you reformat the memory cards that you use for capturing video, you won't also erase all of your custom user files. The card in the utility slot can also be used for recording low-resolution proxy files, and that is much more convenient than when proxies are saved on the same memory card as the full-resolution files. You can apply filters to control which clips are shown in the thumbnail mode. You can view tons more technical metadata about clips in the thumbnail mode. There are several additional status pages that provide even more information about the camera's current settings. Both cameras can capture GPS metadata so that you have a precise record of exactly where and when each clip was shot. You have independent control over the front and rear tally lights. You have 40 different options for customizing exactly how much information is shown in the viewfinder, a feature that can greatly reduce clutter while still keeping your most important dashboard data visible. The new cameras have a picture cache buffer that holds up to 28 seconds of 4K or HD video, so you can literally record action that has already occurred. The Z150 has no picture cache capability at all. The Z280 and 190 allow you to use the low-end color peaking mode found on other cameras if that's what you prefer. But they also come equipped with the far superior normal peaking mode that you find on high-end ENG and cinema cameras, thus making manual focusing so much easier. The difference between the two types of peaking is night and day. There are 3 separate menu settings to control how much detail or sharpness is applied to 4K, HD, and SD recording formats independently. A feature sorely lacking on the Z150 and Z90, where I must have separate picture profiles for 4K and HD recording formats. You can save your scene files, all files, and user files with custom names, thus helping you tell them apart and reminding you what each one of them is used for. The new cameras come equipped with 4 different hypergamma curves that are essential for maximizing dynamic range when S-Log or HLG are not being used. The Z150 doesn't have any hypergamma curves. The new cameras, especially the Z280, have more advanced wireless and streaming capabilities. The native ISO of the Z280 is about 2000 versus only 320 for the Z150, thus making it 2.5 times better for shooting in low light. And finally, both of the new cameras have superior picture quality and much more sophisticated paint menus. So that's a quick look at just some of the features of the Z280 and Z190 that set them apart from cameras such as the Z150, Z90, and even the FS5. In a nutshell, I would describe the Z190 and Z280 as lightweight, easy to use, run-and-gun cameras that are designed to meet, and in most ways exceed, the standards of broadcasters and high-end corporate producers, both in terms of image quality and in terms of workflow. Please never underestimate the importance of speed and efficiency, not just during a shoot, but also when it comes time to working with the files in post. Time is money. You know, it always strikes me as funny how people will get all caught up in pixel peeping and trying to find very slight image quality differences between various cameras, but totally ignore the dozens and dozens of features and functions that represent a huge divide between various cameras. Yes, image quality is important, but it's not the only thing. But let's be honest, every camera comes with pros and cons, and the biggest thing you give up with these cameras when compared to cinema cameras is shallow depth of field. Due to their relatively small sensors, you'll find it harder to get the kind of look that you would from a cinema-style video camera. Shooting with shallow depth of field is not what these cameras were designed to do, and you can either look at that as a bad thing, or you can do as I do and embrace it as one of the camera's many advantages. These cameras are built for shooting situations where shallow depth of field might actually be a hindrance, where changing lenses is not practical, and where robust 10-bit recording formats with up to 4 channels of high-end audio are desired. Another thing you give up with the Z280 and Z190 is the ability to shoot at high frame rates for super slow motion. Neither camera can capture more than 60 frames per second, not even in HD. So although 60 frames per second can give you some decent slow motion ability, it's nowhere near the 120 frames per second that we've come to expect from many other cameras. In my opinion, this is probably the greatest weak spot of the two cameras, and I hope that maybe a firmware update someday might give us 120 frames per second or faster for HD. 4K will probably always be limited to 60 frames per second due to hardware limitations, but then again, there aren't too many other cameras that can even do 60 frames per second in 4K, and there are even fewer cameras that can do 10-bit 4K, so I'm not going to complain too loudly. Now, one nice benefit of the Z280 and Z190 is that their menu systems and other functions are nearly identical. So no matter which camera you own, if you master one of them, you have essentially mastered them both. So we've talked about some of the features that the Z280 and Z190 have in common, but how are they different? Why does one camera cost almost twice as much as the other one? And what do you give up or gain when you choose one over the other? Let's begin with their difference in price. At the time I'm producing this video, the Z280 has a street price of $6,950, while a Z190 can be had for around $3,750, which, as I'll point out, is only a mere $750 more than a Z150. The next most important difference between them is their image sensors. The Z280 features 3 half-inch Exmor CMOS sensors with 4K resolution. On the other hand, the Z190 also uses 3 Exmor CMOS sensors that also have 4K resolution, but with this camera, they're only 1/3 inch in size. So why have different sensor sizes? Well, for the same reason some models of cars offer different engine choices, depending on how much performance the driver requires. Not everyone needs the better image quality and high-end specifications of the Z280, so the Z190 provides a budget-minded option with lesser specifications. As you may know, Sony has a long history of releasing cameras in pairs, where one model is a little bit better than the other, and has functions not found on the less costly model. But the Z190 isn't just a dumbed-down Z280. A big advantage of having smaller sensors is that the Z190 has a significantly longer zoom range than the Z280, which leads us to the next most significant difference between the cameras, and that's their lenses. The Z280 has an excellent Fujinon 17x zoom lens, while the Z190 comes equipped with a very nice 25x Sony G lens. Both lenses produce great looking images, but obviously a lens with a 25x zoom range will provide a lot more flexibility while shooting. Both lenses are very sharp with nice contrast and consistent edge-to-edge brightness, and they're parfocal, meaning that they stay in focus during zooming. As you may know, very few SLR zoom lenses are parfocal, and most SLR lenses are lucky if they can even manage to have a 3x or a 4x zoom range. So when it comes to shooting documentaries, sports, reality television, weddings, news, and other situations where changing lenses simply is not practical, a parfocal lens that has a 17x or a 25x zoom range can be a huge bonus. On this chart, you can see the actual focal length of the two lenses. But because the Z280 has half-inch sensors and the Z190 has 1/3 inch sensors, it's not so easy to compare their relative zoom capabilities. So here's what Sony says is the equivalent 35mm focal length range of the two cameras: 30.3mm to 515mm for the Z280 and 28.8mm to 720mm for the Z190. But those comparisons are in terms of a full-frame 35mm SLR camera that would typically be used by a still photographer. Almost nobody I know in the television and film industry uses full-frame 35mm as their point of reference. So in terms of super 35mm cameras that many of us can identify with, such as the FS5, FS7, or even a Canon C300, here are the equivalent zoom ranges: 18.2mm to 309mm for the Z280 and 17.3mm to 432mm for the Z190. Now, after the focal lengths have been translated to specifications I can relate to, we can see the Z190 has a much greater zoom range than the Z280. It's just slightly wider at one end, but about 40% more telephoto at the other end. In my opinion, other than the price, this is probably the number one reason why someone might decide to choose a Z190 over a Z280. In other words, if having a telephoto lens that can zoom in 40% closer is important to you, then the Z190 might be the better choice of the two cameras. Other differences between the lenses are: the Z280's lens uses 77mm screw-in filters, and the Z190 takes 82mm filters. The aperture range for the Z280 goes from f1.9 to f16. On the Z190, the range goes from f1.6 to f11. But those specifications are misleading. If you just look at these two numbers, it might be easy to jump to the conclusion that the Z190 would be slightly better at low light shooting. But nothing could be further from the truth. In my testing, the Z190 is actually about 4 stops less capable in low light than the Z280. That is a huge difference, and perhaps even the top difference between the two cameras. Outdoors in bright light, the cameras do look surprisingly similar. But get them into low light, and the Z280 easily beats the pants off of the Z190. Look at this example. The Z190 would need about 24 dB of gain to compete with the Z280 at 0 dB. That's a 4-stop difference. The Z280 is really excellent in low light with very little noise. In fact, often it is actually too sensitive in bright light. I frequently shoot outdoors at -3 dB and still add a screw-in 2-stop ND filter to the lens because the built-in ND filter maxes out at 7 stops. And that isn't enough sometimes for me to shoot with the aperture I want to use. We'll talk more about exposure in Chapter 12 and the paint menus in Chapter 16. Both cameras use the same batteries, but the Z280 consumes a few more watts of juice than the Z190. By the way, power consumption is variable depending on whether the LCD or viewfinder or both at the same time are turned on. Both cameras have nearly the exact same physical dimensions, but the Z280 is just a few ounces heavier than the Z190. Both cameras have the exact same LCD panel, and they both have gorgeous OLED viewfinders. But the viewfinder on the Z280 is 30% larger and has 50% better resolution than the Z190. Both cameras have the ability to shoot with Sony's hybrid log gamma mode, but only the Z280 can shoot with S-Log, which again ought to be a major consideration for people who are already shooting with S-Log 3 capable 10-bit 4K cameras such as the F55, FS7, or Z450. Only the Z280 can record with Sony's XAVC-I codec. Only the Z280 can record with Sony's MPEG HD 422 codec, often called XDCAM HD 422, without paying for an upgrade. Only the Z280 has a dedicated steady shot button. On the Z190, you have to use one of your assigned buttons. However, only the Z190 has both regular and active steady shot. The Z280 only has regular steady shot. We'll talk about the differences between those two modes in Chapter 8. Both cameras have 4 channels of audio, but only the Z280 has external volume controls for all 4 channels. The Z280 records natively on S/S memory cards, while the Z190 records on SD cards or memory sticks. Yes, you can also use adapters with the Z280 that will allow you to use less expensive SD cards and XQD cards, but there are many restrictions. We'll talk more about memory cards in Chapter 6. The Z280 offers 48 dB turbo gain, while the Z190 only offers 30 dB turbo gain. The Z190 has some restrictions as to which of the 4K recording formats are compatible with S&Q motion. We'll talk about that in Chapter 24. The Z190 never maintains a constant exposure when the focal length is changed. Both cameras have 4K HDMI output and 3G HDSDI output, but the Z280 goes quite a bit further by having 12G SDI output capability. In other words, 4K output using a single B&C cable. Even the F55 and FS7 can't do that. Only the Z280 can output standard definition composite video. Only the Z280 has Genlock in. Only the Z280 can record 4K and HD simultaneously, and it does it on the same memory card. Only the Z280 allows you to create your own custom metering zone for auto exposure. The Z280 offers a greater number of paint menus for customizing the look of the camera. Only the Z280 can insert invisible shot marks and clip flags. Only the Z280 allows you to use planning metadata files. Only the Z280 has a dedicated macro focus switch. And finally, the Z280 has a ton more functions that have to do with streaming, wireless connectivity, FTP transfers, Wi-Fi remote control, and much more without paying for an upgrade. However, I do need to disclose that this masterclass does not cover FTP transfer, streaming, dual-link cellular, Sony's proprietary QoS streaming service, Wi-Fi remote control, or interfacing with XDCAM Air. Why? Because most of those things are simply too complex to set up, and I seriously doubt that even 1% of camera owners will ever do it. If you do not have an IT person in your organization to help you, or you are not knowledgeable yourself about setting up networks, configuring DNS settings, creating hosts, and choosing the correct port settings, not to mention having the right servers, routers, and other hardware, you are going to find it extremely difficult to set up. And even then, there will still be many limitations that you'll have to deal with. Now, I don't mean to imply that the wireless networking capabilities aren't very robust and aren't great features to have for the right people. I'm just saying that you are highly unlikely to be one of those people, so I'm not going to spend time covering it. After all, streaming and FTP transfer have very little to do with the operation of the camera itself, which is the focus of this masterclass. So, at this point during one of my camcorder masterclasses, I like to lay the groundwork for the rest of the video series by taking a quick tour around the camcorder to help you get familiar with the external buttons and controls. Then we'll come back to them in later chapters for more details. And speaking of upcoming chapters, there are a lot of them. We'll be covering recording formats, paint menus, S-Log, focusing, assign buttons, time-lapse, white balance, exposure, clip naming, and nearly everything in between. About the only thing we won't be covering, as I said earlier, is the camera's streaming and network functions. Now, because the Z280 and the Z190 are not entry-level cameras, I'm going to proceed with the assumption that you already have some experience under your belt shooting video professionally and have at least a basic understanding of the general principles of television and film production. You won't find any filler in this training video on general topics that would apply to all cameras, such as depth of field, composition, lighting, and so forth. In this workshop, we want to stay focused as much as possible on the features and functions that you need to know in order to get great results with your new camera. As I said earlier, the goal of this workshop is to help flatten the learning curve and save you a lot of time mastering your new camera. So let's get started because, as I like to say, we've got a lot of ground to cover. First off, because the Z280 is the more advanced model of the two cameras and includes nearly all of the available features and functions of the Z190, I'll primarily be using it during this presentation. But don't worry, whenever there are important differences between the two cameras, I'll be sure to point them out. And so I'll do that right now. As we look at the left side of the cameras, they look very much the same at first glance, don't they? But when you look a little closer, you can see there are subtle differences between them. Notice that not only is the overall design of the two lenses different, but the Z280 also has a number of buttons and switches on the lens that aren't found on the Z190's lens. Notice that the Z280 has f-stop markings around the iris ring, but there are none on the Z190. The controls in this area are exactly the same. But notice that the Z190 has a couple of extra controls just to the right, which basically replace some of the controls I just pointed out that are missing from the lens. Down here, we see another difference between the cameras. But as we move farther back along the body, we find that almost everything else is exactly the same. The only exception being that the Z280 has volume level controls for all 4 channels of audio, while the Z190 has only 2. Even though the Z190 can also record 4 channels of audio, setting the volume for channels 3 and 4 must be done from a menu page. Inconvenient? Yes, but that's one of the things you give up in order to save money buying a less expensive camera. Fortunately, both cameras do have independent rings for aperture, zoom, and focus. The focus ring is a unique Sony design that should immediately look familiar to anyone who's previously used an EX1, EX3, or X200. Notice that the focus ring can be moved forward to activate semi-auto focusing or moved to the rear position for full manual focusing. Down here, there's a switch to turn on full autofocus and a button called push autofocus that will allow you to momentarily activate autofocus for as long as you hold it down. Just above the 2 autofocus controls, there's a switch for activating macro focus. The Z190 doesn't have a macro switch on the lens, but it does have a macro focus mode. The difference is that you must turn it on or off by changing a menu setting or using an assign button. And one gotcha to be aware of is that macro focusing on both cameras is disabled in full manual focus mode. We'll spend a lot of time talking about manual focusing, the various autofocus modes, and even some semi-autofocus modes when we get to Chapter 14. Next, there's a switch for choosing either manual or auto iris. However, because there are literally dozens of variations on how to configure auto exposure on these cameras, we'll wait to explore them in more detail during Chapter 13. Now let's take a closer look at the Z190's lens. Once again, there are 3 separate rings for aperture, zoom, and focus. But unlike the Z280, there are no hard stops when you reach the limits for zoom or iris. Those 2 rings will just rotate endlessly in either direction when you turn them. The position of this switch is what determines if focusing will be done automatically or manually. And just like the Z280, there's a handy focus push auto button that will allow you to momentarily activate autofocus for as long as you hold it down. Just below the lens on the front of both cameras, there's a white balance set button, located right where you'd expect it to be on a professional E&G camera. Returning back to the Z280 now, on the upper part of the lens we find a dedicated button to turn steady shot image stabilization on or off. The Z190 doesn't have a dedicated steady shot button, but that's one of the many functions that can be activated with an assign button. And what are assign buttons? Well, assign buttons are a standard Sony camcorder feature that have been around for several years, so you may already understand what their purpose is, but just in case you're not familiar with them, let me explain. Basically, the Z280 has 10 assign buttons scattered around various locations on the camera body, and the Z190 has 8. Numbers 1 to 5 are clustered together in this area. Number 6 is a little higher up on the camera body. 7 and 8 are located on the grip, and numbers 9 and 10 on the Z280 only are located down here. Each one of the assign buttons can be customized to instantly activate any one of dozens of special functions which you get to choose. In other words, assign buttons allow you to easily turn your most frequently used settings on or off at the touch of a button without having to scroll through layers of menus. As you'll see, any of the assign buttons can be programmed for any of the nearly 50 available functions. Yes, I said 50, which is double the number of functions that most other Sony cameras offer. Some of the available functions are last clip delete, shot mark, digital extender, turbo gain, and one-touch playback of the last clip you shot. We'll take a closer look at all the assign button options during Chapter 8, but for now, please notice that some of the buttons have been pre-programmed with the default function. For example, as you can see by the label above it, both cameras come from the factory with assign button number 1 already programmed to turn zebra on and off, and assign button number 2 is programmed for peaking. So you can either leave them programmed for that setting, or you can change them to something else that may suit your needs better. For example, I never turn off zebra and I never turn off peaking, so I certainly don't want to waste 2 of my precious assign buttons on those functions. Assign buttons number 5 and number 6 don't have any labels printed next to them because they don't have any pre-programmed functions. In other words, buttons number 5 and number 6 don't do anything at all unless you decide to give them one of the assigned functions. As I mentioned, there's a whole chapter later in the workshop that will explain what you can do with the assign buttons, so for now, let's move on. Next to assign button number 6, we find the full auto button that provides an easy way to instantly change several of the camera settings to automatic. Those settings are iris, gain, shutter speed, white balance, and even the neutral density filter. We'll talk more about that new feature later on, but for now, please note that other camera functions, such as focus and audio levels, are not affected by this button. Also, it's interesting to note that full auto is the only button on the camera with its own internal LED light to remind you when it's been activated. Down here, we find a sliding switch for turning the shutter on or off, but as we'll see later, the actual shutter speed is determined by a menu setting. But if you want to get technical about it, no video camera can ever have the shutter turned off, even if there is a switch that says the shutter is off. It's simply impossible. When you slide the switch to off, what you are really doing is telling the camera to match the shutter speed to the frame rate. So, for example, if you're shooting with a 24p recording format, then the shutter speed will be 1/24th of a second when the switch is off. I'll talk about shutter speed in more detail in Chapter 12, and I'll explain why this switch should probably never be turned off. If it was an assign button, you can be sure that I'd be reprogramming it for something else. Over here, we find an essential component of any professional camcorder, and that's the neutral density filter switch. But unless you've shot with an FS5 or FS7 Mark II, odds are that you've probably never used an ND filter like this before. First of all, you have the option of using it like a conventional ND filter switch with settings for clear, plus 3 different density options. By default, the values are 2 stops for filter 1, 4 stops for filter 2, and 6 stops for filter 3. But the amazing thing is that because the ND filters are being applied electronically, you can choose whatever density you want for each of the 3 positions of the switch, from as little as 2 stops up to as many as 7 stops. But that's not all. Both cameras also offer a continuously variable mode that allows you to change the amount of ND filtering that is being applied as if you were turning the volume on a radio or the dimmer on an LED light. Want it just a little darker or lighter? Then just spin the dial. This is truly an amazing advancement that you'll quickly wonder how you ever got along without. The ND filtering is applied smoothly, without any visible steps, and no detrimental effects to the picture quality or color. So imagine the freedom of being able to set your aperture, ISO, and shutter speed exactly how you want them, and then just crank the ND filter up or down to account for the different levels of light. That is a huge benefit that the Z280 and Z190 have over almost all other cameras. Just to the right of the ND filter switch, we find a switch that is used for selecting which one of the 2 ND filter modes you want to use at any given time. But it's a little more complicated than just flipping a switch, so we'll wait until Chapter 12 to explore the ND filter options in more detail. Located just below the ND filter controls on the Z280, we find assign buttons number 9 and number 10. Since number 9 doesn't have a label printed next to it, you may correctly assume that it does not have a default function. However, number 10 has been pre-programmed to momentarily activate the camera's auto iris while it's being held down. We'll talk more about how to use iris push auto in chapter 13. But of course, if you don't think you'll ever use auto iris, you can program this button for something else instead. On the Z190, this button is slightly different. Notice that it also functions as an iris push auto button, but there's one fundamental difference. There's no number 10 printed next to it. So this is not an assigned button and therefore cannot have its function changed. It is what it is. Here, we see that on the Z190, assigned button number 9 has been replaced with a switch to turn auto iris on and off. On the Z280, if you recall, that switch is located on the lens. As we move further back along the body, once again, both cameras become identical. Here, we see the same type of toggle switch for gain that is found on any professional ENG camera with 3 positions. The default values are 0 dB for L, 9 dB for M, and 18 dB for H. But each of those settings can be reprogrammed if you'd prefer something else instead. The allowable range goes from -3 dB up to +18 dB. Next, we find the white balance memory switch that controls, yes, you guessed it, white balance. It has 3 positions for preset, memory A, and memory B. If you've used professional camcorders before, this switch should look familiar, but there are some new twists regarding white balance that we'll discuss later in chapter 15. Over here, we find the menu button. Not surprisingly, pressing the menu button provides access to the camera's vast menu system where you can make literally hundreds of custom changes and thousands of different combinations of changes to the camera's configuration. The Select Set dial is one of the 3 ways that you can scroll through the menu pages and make changes. You spin it to highlight the setting you want and then make a selection by pressing in on it. The Cancel Back button allows you to undo menu changes or jump back one level in the menu hierarchy. We'll explore the menu system in more detail during chapter 2. In this area of the camera, behind a protective door, we find most of the audio controls. Both cameras can capture 4 channels of high-quality 24-bit 48 kHz audio, but only the Z280 has an extra pair of dials that allow you to control the recording levels of channels 3 and 4. Just above the main audio controls, we find the camera's headphone jack. There's a special audio menu that we'll see later that allows you to designate which of the 4 channels you're monitoring and how they're mixed in your headphones. You can even customize how loud the alarm sounds when the battery is getting low or when you're running out of space on your memory card. And believe me, if you're as annoyed by those alarms blaring in your headphones as much as I am on other cameras, you will love having the ability to turn it down. Now there's a whole chapter devoted to audio a little later in this masterclass, and I don't want to waste your time explaining things twice, so once again, let's move along. Which brings us to the rear of the camera. No matter which camera you're using, don't forget to take a second to adjust the optics of the eyepiece by spinning the diopter wheel so that the image in the viewfinder precisely matches your eyesight. Both cameras also give you the option of attaching a larger eye cup included with the camera to help block ambient light. Personally, I don't care for it, but your experience might be different, so I suggest you give it a try and see what you think. Next, we finally come to the power switch, which I hope is self-explanatory. Slide it to the left to turn the camera on, slide it to the right to turn the camera off. Over here, the slot select button allows you to designate which of the 2 memory cards you're recording onto at any given time, unless of course you're using the camera's simultaneous recording mode to record to both cards at once. It's good to know that with most of the recording formats, if one card fills up during recording, the camera will automatically switch to the other card without missing a single frame. That's called relay recording. In fact, you can even hot swap cards without interrupting the recording, so in theory, you could record non-stop forever. Speaking of memory cards, the camera's 2 memory card slots are located right here. The slots are known as A and B. And here we find another difference between the 2 cameras. The Z280 records natively onto Sony's amazingly reliable and robust S/S cards. In over 11 years of using S/S cards, on literally thousands of shoots, with about a half-dozen different Sony camcorders that I've owned, I've never experienced a single glitch, corrupted card, or lost clip. Most other types of memory cards cannot match that kind of reliability. But S/S cards are not the only option for the Z280. You can also record on less expensive XQD cards or SD cards if you have the correct adapter. Things are a lot simpler on the Z190, which can only record on SD cards, and I highly recommend that you only use the fastest, highest quality SDXC Class 10 memory cards you can find. As long as we're on the subject of memory cards, let's jump over here for a minute and talk about the third card slot, which is the same on both cameras. This is what's known as the utility card slot. And you're more than welcome to use inexpensive SD cards in this slot because it's never used for recording full resolution video files. The cards in this slot are primarily used for storing scene files, all files, and user menu files that are collectively referred to as user data. The ability to store these various types of personal preference files on a dedicated utility card in a special slot is a big advantage compared to many other cameras. But that's not all this card slot is used for. Both the Z280 and the Z190 have the ability to record low-resolution proxy files. Now, the idea behind proxy files is that they provide frame-accurate, lightweight files that are suitable for faster file transfers and convenient file sharing over the web. But a big difference between these cameras and other cameras that can record proxy files is where the files are stored. On most cameras, proxy files are stored in a special folder on the same memory card as the full resolution files. Now that can be okay, but it's a heck of a lot more convenient to have the proxies stored on a special card all of their own. A card that can easily be ejected and just handed over to a producer, a client, or other crew member without any processing or offloading. We'll talk more about proxy files in Chapter 5, and all three types of user data files in other chapters. Located just below the SD card slot is the camera's full-size HDMI out connector. And located just above the SD card slot is one of the camera's three USB connectors. This Type A connector is called the USB 3.0 host. Just above it, we find the multi-micro USB connector. And on top of the camera, under a rubber cover, we have another Type A connector. This one is called the USB 2.0 host. So there you have it, 3 USB connections on one little camera. And the logical question is, why are there 3 of them and what are the differences among them? This one can be used to copy full resolution video clips directly from either or both of the memory cards to an external hard drive or SSD or other storage device without the need for a computer. I'll show you how to do that in Chapter 6. This one is used when you want to connect the camera to a computer and basically turn it into one of the world's most expensive card readers. But obviously there are better ways of ingesting clips than using the camera as a card reader. Another use of this connector is to output 2 channels of audio, but that requires a special AV cable from Sony that is sold separately. And even though the AV cable has a video connector, all you're going to get from it is 2 channels of audio. And finally, the sole purpose of the connector on top of the camera is to attach a 3G or 4G modem so the camera can connect to a wireless LAN. But as I said before, that topic goes beyond the scope of this masterclass. Next, we have the battery slot. And the battery release button is located right here. Just press it in and slide the battery up and out. Sony offers 4 batteries that are designed for use with the Z280 and Z190. The small BPU-30, which came with your camera, the BPU-60 with double the capacity of the U-30, the BPU-60T that is identical to the regular U-60 except that it adds a Hiroshi connector for powering compatible accessories such as a wireless microphone receiver, and finally the BPU-90 with triple the capacity of the U-30. By the way, these are the exact same batteries that are used with the FS7 and FS5 plus many other camcorders that came before them. I would caution you, however, about buying one of the U90 batteries because it will protrude so far behind the camera that you'll have trouble getting your eyeball against the viewfinder during handheld shooting. In fact, to be honest, I even find the smaller U60 battery to be right on the verge of being too big. Sony currently offers 2 battery chargers, the BCU1 for charging a single battery, and the BCU2 which can charge 2 batteries at once or charge 1 battery while simultaneously supplying 12-volt power to run the camcorder. To power the camera from either a U1 or a U2, you simply connect it to the DC-in connector located right here. Over here, arranged vertically, we find several connectors, which are different for the 2 cameras. Let's look at the Z280 first. At the top, we have the camera's only SDI connector. But this is not your daddy's SDI connector that can only do HD. No, this is a 12G SDI connector that can output full resolution 4K video over a single B&C cable. And that's a great feature that even the F55, F5, and Z450 and other Sony cameras cannot match. Of course, you must also have a 12G compatible monitor or external recorder at the other end to take advantage of it, but those devices are becoming more and more common every year. Naturally, if you don't have a 12G capable device yet, the default output signal is just standard 3G SDI. We'll talk more about the capabilities and limitations of the SDI and HDMI connectors in Chapter 22. The next connector is for timecode in or timecode out, depending on the position of the in-out switch located just around the corner, thus allowing you to jam sync the camera with other cameras on a multi-camera shoot. As you probably know, having synchronous timecode numbers recorded on each camera in a multi-camera shoot is worth its weight in gold when it comes time for editing. Just one more example of how the Z280 and Z190 were designed for serious professionals who value speed and efficiency. We'll talk more about timecode in Chapter 23. And to take multi-camera production to an even higher level, there's also a Genlock in connector. Genlock is used for synchronizing the internal timing of the camera with other equipment, such as in a studio situation or on a remote shoot that uses live switching. But depending on the position of the in-out switch and various menu settings, this connector also does double duty as a video out jack. And finally, we come to the camera's wired LAN port that allows you to connect the camera to the internet with a standard Ethernet cable, thus allowing video to be streamed or clips to be transferred by FTP. Two things that we won't be covering in this masterclass. As I noted, the Z280 and Z190 have some differences here at the rear of the camera, so let's switch over and look at the Z190 now. Once again, we find an SDI connector, but on the Z190, it's just a normal 3G connector that cannot output a 4K signal. The Z190 has the same timecode in-out connector as the Z280, but you'll notice that the Genlock in video out connector is missing from this camera. Swinging around to the right side of either camera, we find the camera's remote connector. It uses the industry standard LINK protocol, so it's possible to attach one of Sony's optional remote commanders or a wide variety of third-party LINK controllers. Personally, I use a Sony RM1BP because it allows easy control of focus, zoom, record start stop, and even one-touch clip playback with my right hand while I'm shooting from a tripod. This is especially convenient for wildlife and sports. Over here, we find the grip, which has several important controls located on it. First, there's a record start-stop button that has been conveniently placed for use by your thumb during handheld shooting. Right next to it, we find the multi-selector control that can be used like a joystick to navigate through the camera's menu system and also through thumbnail images during playback. When you want to make a selection, you just press in on the center of the multi-selector. On top of the grip, there's a pressure-sensitive variable speed zoom rocker switch for executing zooms with nice smooth starts and stops. If you're shooting with the Z280 and you press down on the switch and nothing happens, the likely cause is that the zoom switch underneath the camera is set for manual. You could use this switch to select between servo or manual zoom control, but not both at the same time. So be careful not to turn the zoom ring on the lens manually if this switch is in servo position, or you could damage the gears. Be aware that the Z190 does not have this switch, and therefore both servo zoom and manual zoom are always available, which is a very nice feature to have. Next, on both cameras, we find assigned buttons number 7 and number 8. You can tell by the labels printed next to them what their default functions are. But of course, since they're assigned buttons, you've got nearly 50 other functions to choose from if you'd prefer something else instead. We'll take a look at all the other options in Chapter 8. As you can see, button number 7 is programmed to activate the camera's direct menu mode. So that brings up the logical question, what the heck is the direct menu? Well, the easiest way to explain it is to demonstrate it. Watch what happens when I press assigned button number 7. An orange underlined cursor is displayed beneath each of the settings that can be changed via the direct menu. The idea behind the direct menu is to provide a quick way of changing certain settings during handheld shooting without taking your eyeball off the viewfinder. After the direct menu button has been pressed, you could use the 4 arrow buttons, or the joystick, or the select set wheel to cycle through whatever settings are available for changing. For example, we can see that there are 10 settings right now that can be modified. The white balance preset mode, the white balance value, the scene file, the ND filter value, the gain mode, the the gain value, the shutter mode, the shutter speed, the auto exposure compensation mode, the auto exposure compensation value, and then it loops around back to the white balance preset mode again. Now, don't be concerned if you don't know what some of these functions do. We'll talk about all those controls in later chapters. The point I want you to understand right now is that direct menu is a very handy way of quickly changing many settings on the camera without digging into the regular menus or fumbling around to flip switches or press buttons on the side of the camera. Sure, after you've used the camera enough times, it might become second nature where various controls are located on the camera body, and maybe you could operate the camera without ever looking at it. But in the meantime, direct menu is the next best thing. If a setting is highlighted rather than just underlined, it means that setting is currently selected and is ready to be changed. For example, right now we see that the shutter speed is highlighted. So if we wanted to change the speed, I press in on the center of the joystick and then toggle the joystick up to reduce the shutter speed or down to increase the shutter speed. When I see the setting I want, I can lock it in by pressing in on the center of the joystick. I can then press assign button number 7 to exit the direct menu, or if no action is performed in 3 seconds, it will turn off automatically. So what settings can be changed via the direct menu? Well, this is where it gets a little crazy. On other cameras that I've used in the past that have the direct menu feature, there are only 6 or 7 settings that can be changed. But on the Z280 and the Z190, there are almost 20. However, depending on the camera's current configuration, only some of those 20 functions can be selected at any given time. As we saw just a minute ago, there are only 10 settings right now that can be changed on my camera. Nevertheless, here's a list of all the possible settings. By the way, only settings that are visible in the viewfinder at any given time can actually be changed with the direct menu. So as we'll see in Chapter 3, if you've programmed the viewfinder display to hide any information, such as shutter speed, you won't be able to change it using the direct menu method. As you can see, button number 8 on the grip is pre-programmed to activate the camera's focus magnifier mode, which works differently depending on whether the camera is set up to record with a 4K recording format or an HD recording format. If you're shooting in 4K, then pressing button number 8 will electronically magnify the center of the image in the viewfinder by 400%, thus making it easier to check the focus. You could use the joystick to change which part of the image is being magnified, or press in on the joystick to go back to the center position. Pressing the button a second time will magnify the image by 800%, and pressing it a third time will return the image to normal. Now you can use focus magnifier even while you're recording because it's purely a monitoring function and it doesn't affect the image that's being recorded internally or what's being output by any of the video connectors. However, if you're shooting in HD, then the button works differently. When you press the button once, the image is magnified 2x, and when you press the button again, the screen returns to normal. 2 XLR jacks are provided up here on the handle for connecting external microphones, audio mixers, wireless receivers, or any other professional audio source. But unlike other Sony cameras, all of the switches that control the audio signals that are being input into the connectors are conveniently located over on the other side of the camera with the rest of the audio controls. In my opinion, this is an excellent improvement to the layout of the camera and one that I've been suggesting for several years. We'll talk more about all the audio switches, dials, and connectors and menus in Chapter 21. Above the lens hood, there's a built-in stereo microphone that ought to be fine for shooting situations where getting perfect audio isn't necessary. But for improved performance, I recommend attaching an external shotgun microphone using the shock-mounted holder. Depending on your budget, there are quite a few microphones that will work great with these cameras. The microphone that I use on my camera is a Sony ECM MS2. The metal body reduces vibration and shields it from interference, plus the short length prevents it from creeping into the corners of the shot and thus causing vignetting. Up on the very front of the camera's handle, we find one of the 2 multi-interface shoes. And the other MI shoe is located at the rear of the handle. Now, MI shoes are another feature found on Sony camcorders that have been around for a few years now, so you might already be familiar with them. Now what makes them so special is they have recessed electrical contacts that facilitate two-way communication with the camera. For example, certain devices such as one of Sony's wireless microphone receivers can pass audio to the camera and also get power from the camera without any wires, extra batteries, or cables. The microphone system literally becomes part of the camera rather than a clunky attached accessory. There are two microphone receivers to choose from. One is a single channel receiver, but the other one offers dual channel operation and thus can receive audio from two different transmitters simultaneously. There's even another accessory attachment that can be used to add two additional XLR jacks to your camera, for a grand total of 4. We'll talk about all those accessories in more detail when we get to Chapter 21. However, please note that you can never use both MI-shoes for audio simultaneously. Only one or the other can be used at any given time. So if only one MI-shoe can be used at a time for audio, what can the other MI-shoe be used for? Well, another accessory that's compatible with the multi-interface shoe is Sony's LED light. Although it must have its own battery because it can't draw power from the camera, it does offer the convenience of turning on and off automatically when the camera's record button is pressed. But personally, whenever I need an on-camera light, my weapon of choice is one of my Light Panel's Chroma 2 LED lights, which I feel are a much better value than the Sony light at about half the price. The Chroma 2 weighs just 11 ounces and can be powered by either 6 rechargeable AA batteries or a standard Sony L-Series type battery. The light can be dimmed from 0 to 100% seamlessly, and the color temperature can be adjusted from 3100 to 5600K simply by turning a knob. It's a great light for news, documentaries, events, and other run-and-gun scenarios. Next, we find a standard 1/4-20 threaded socket that's perfect for mounting all kinds of accessories. Over here we have another zoom rocker switch. With the factory default mode, the zoom speed is variable, meaning the harder you press down on the switch, the faster the focal length changes. But if you'd rather have the zoom operate at a constant speed, you could select that mode by changing one of the camera's menus and then choosing from 8 different zoom speeds. We'll talk about those options in Chapter 20. Next, we have yet another record start-stop button. And with this one, you can rotate the hold switch to prevent the button from being pushed accidentally. Underneath where the LCD monitor is stowed, you'll find quite a few buttons and switches for playback, headphone volume, timecode display, and much more. Over here, we have a cluster of 7 buttons that offer an alternative way of navigating through the camera's menus. It's totally up to you whether you want to use these buttons, the joystick on the grip, or the buttons we looked at on the side of the camera. They all basically serve the same function. Anytime you want to play back clips that are stored on one of the memory cards, all you have to do is press the thumbnail button, and the playback mode will be ready to go almost instantly. You can then use the arrow buttons to navigate through the clips. A cool feature of the Z280 and 190 is that if something suddenly happens while you're playing back a clip and you want to start shooting again right away, you can just hit the record button and the camera will exit the playback mode and start recording in about 2 seconds. The purpose of the rest of the playback buttons ought to be obvious, but there are a few hidden functions that we'll talk about when we get to Chapter 26. The fastest way to end playback of a clip and to get back to the standby mode is to press the thumbnail button twice. Next, we find the status button, which makes it easy to display several pages of information about the camera's current settings without having to drill down to look at each individual menu. The status screens are a big time saver, and they're something you should get in the habit of using often. Unfortunately, none of the settings can be changed from the status pages. All you can do is look at them. In normal operation, the Z280 has 12 different pages of information, and the Z190 has 10. And the main reason why the Z280 has more pages is because it has a bunch of networking functionality that isn't included on the Z190. The first status page is called Camera, and you can view information about the current settings of the white balance switch, the gain switch, the ND filter, the 2 zebra settings, and more. To change to the next status page, you just spin the jog dial on the side of the camera, or you can use the up or down arrow buttons on the handle, or the joystick on the grip. Status page 2 shows all of the most important audio related settings, including audio level meters that are several times larger than the default audio meters that are normally shown at the bottom corner of the LCD screen. Whenever you're setting critical audio levels, these are the meters you should be looking at. Page 3 is the system status page. Here we can see the current scan frequency, the video codec, clip naming information, and more. Page 4 gives us a nice concise summary of the major settings of the various video output connectors and the gamma mode. Page 5 shows the current function of each of the assigned buttons. Page 6 shows battery information, including when the battery is manufactured and how many times it's been charged. Page 7 shows the status of all 3 memory cards. Page 8 tells us how the record buttons are programmed to function. We'll talk about all the possible configurations in Chapter 6. Page 9 shows GPS information. Page 10 shows the network status of any LAN connection that you may have made. In this case, you can see everything is turned off on my camera. Also, this is the final status page that will be visible on the Z190. Everything else from here on out only applies to the Z280. Page 11 shows the network client mode and streaming status. And finally, page 12 shows the status of any FTP transfers that might be in progress. In some instances, such as if you're connected to a network for live streaming, several additional status pages will be shown, but under normal operation, you'll only see 12. Pressing the status button again clears the display completely from the screen. To adjust the brightness of the LCD monitor's backlight, you can press the LCD Bright button. I like to keep mine on the brightest setting all the time, even though it does use a little more battery power. The Display button allows you to quickly clear the LCD monitor and viewfinder of almost all the on-screen clutter, and then bring it back again. However, if this is more information than you care to see, I'll show you in Chapter 3 how a lot of this information can be customized and/or hidden on an individual basis. Headphone volume is controlled with this pair of buttons, which is much more convenient than having to deal with menu-based controls as with a lot of other cameras. Next, the Duration Timecode User Bit button can be used to choose whether you want to display timecode numbers, user bits, or the duration of the last clip. By pressing the button repeatedly, you can cycle through all 3 displays. Duration is a great little feature that I've turned on nearly all the time. With the duration option selected, the duration of the current clip will start counting up from 0 when I press the record button. And when I stop the camera, the running time of the clip I just recorded will be displayed until I press the record button again. And then the counter resets itself to 0 and counts up. As I said, I'm a huge fan of the duration display and sorely miss it when I'm forced to use a camera that doesn't have it. Underneath the camera, we find both 1/4 inch and 3/8 inch threaded sockets for rock-solid attachment to a tripod, thus avoiding the potential problems you get from twisting or rotating with cameras that only use 1 screw. My favorite tripod to use with my Z280 is the Sachtler FSB-10 head and Flowtech 100 legs that can be deployed in a matter of seconds. A less expensive and lighter weight option is my Sachtler FSB-6 head and Flowtech 75 legs that I'm using with the Z190. Although they look quite similar and are perfectly capable of handling either of these 2 cameras with ease, the advantage of the FSB-10 and Flowtech 100 is that they have a higher payload capacity and can therefore be used to support some of my other camera rigs that weigh many times more than the Z280 or Z190. In fact, the FSB-10 has been great for shooting test footage for this MasterClass with both cameras mounted at the same time. With their carbon fiber construction, both of the Flowtech tripods are much stronger and more robust than comparable tripods in their class. But the real advantage of these legs is how fast and easy they are to deploy. Notice that there are no locks on the legs themselves. Everything is done with a unique quick-release lock near the base. No more bending over to lock or unlock the legs one at a time. The Flowtech tripods can even drop down to just a few inches above ground level, thus limiting the need for baby legs or hi-hats. If you're looking for an excellent tripod that you'll probably never outgrow, I highly recommend test driving a Flowtech 100 with an FSB-10. But if you don't think you'll ever shoot with heavier cameras and you want a lighter weight setup that still offers professional performance, then the Flowtech 75 with an FSB-6 might be just the ticket. As I said earlier, it's clear that the Z280 and 190 were designed as grab-and-go cameras for lightweight, handheld, run-and-gun shooting. And one accessory I never leave home without is my Storm Jacket camera cover, which protects it not just from rain, but also snow, sleet, dust, dirt, and UV rays when it's sitting on a tripod in the sun. The Storm Jacket I'm using right now is a Black Medium Pro, and it's the perfect size for either of these 2 cameras. There's a bungee cord at one end that can be cinched around the viewfinder, and another bungee cord at the other end that closes around the lens hood. Underneath, there's a Velcro opening that allows my hand to reach inside and grab the grip. or to facilitate mounting the camera to a tripod while the storm jacket is protecting the camera. With the storm jacket snugly wrapped around the camera, I've got an affordable, hassle-free solution for protecting my camera that can be put on and taken off in under a minute, and stores in its own zippered carrying case. So that concludes our quick overview of the cameras, and you should now have a pretty good understanding of the major features of the Z280 and the Z190, plus a general sense of where the important buttons and controls are located. But what I haven't done is give you very much detail, and that's what's coming up in the next 26 chapters.